And I'm Gary, and today on Fact or Fiction, we'll be talking about the space race. We're here to argue that the tense Cold War relationship between the US and Soviet Union actually led to incredible achievements in space and modern technology.
So let's jump right in. The space race was a big rivalry between Americans and Soviets between 1955 and 1975. During this period, the big debate raged on. Who is the most advanced country of these great superpowers? They competed in everything.
Fresh off two major world wars, both countries were particularly interested in being the best at rocket technology, both for missiles.
Like the German V-2 missiles that were capable of decimating an entire city at long range.
And rockets that could send satellites and spacecrafts into space.
After numerous UFO sightings, there was also pressure to keep our country safe from potential hostile alien invasion.
Larry, did you get that information from aliensarreal.com? I'm pretty sure that's not a reliable source. Actually, these tense relations were mostly because of two opposing world ideologies. West countries were pushing free democratic governments, and the Soviets were all about total control and rule.
Yes, Stalin, the Soviet dictator guy, was a jerk. He sent anyone suspicious of not being loyal to the Communist Party into the Gulag, a horrible prison camp that took almost 2 million lives. So not surprisingly, it scared the pants off the Americans. And so in 1957, when the Soviets managed to launch the first ever satellite into space, Sputnik 1.
Right. You see, at the end of World War II, the Americans scored the best German rocket engineer, Wernher von Braun, and the Soviets had their own rocket engineer, Sergei Korolev.
Sputnik 1 proved Korolev was kicking von Braun's space butt. Sources say it's because he had access to the aliens, and their technology backing up the claim the aliens are definitely communist.
Larry, once again, not a reliable source. But one thing is for sure, a Soviet satellite flying right above our country worried Americans. It also proved that their rocket technology was superior to the United States.
Making matters worse, the Soviets kept beating the Americans in space. The next big splash was when they sent the first animal into space, Laika the dog, into orbit in 1957.
Even though they totally lied about that one, claiming that Laika was still alive for 6 or 7 days when she actually only lived for 5 or 6 hours.
Either way, it was a big accomplishment, and just 4 years later, the Soviets stunned the world again when they sent their first man into orbit, Yuri Gagarin.
That's when the US realized it was time to get serious. 4 months later, President Kennedy made his famous speech.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Soon after, the US got their first astronaut, John Glenn, into space and safely back.
3 years later, in 1965, the Americans were humbled yet again by the Soviets when cosmonaut Alexei Leonov was the first man to go on a spacewalk, an important step for a lunar landing.
Right around that time is when things finally started to take off for the American space program. Tired of being second best, the US committed way more dollars to the space program, like $20 billion extra dollars. Now their boy Wernher von Braun and his scientists could really turn up the heat. And coincidentally, this is also when the Soviets lost their beloved space genius, Korolev.
Correct. The aliens decided to abduct him because his epic space skills were getting too good, but it presented a security risk.
Actually, he just died from a botched hemorrhoid operation. Despite the loss, both countries kept pushing hard to beat each other getting to the moon, and the process saw many successes and failures.
Let's start with some failures. In 1967, the U.S. had the Apollo 1 tragedy. 3 astronauts were launched when a fire started in a test capsule and they got trapped inside.
The Soviets had their first spaceflight fatality the same year. A technical failure led to the parachute not deploying on the Soyuz 1 descent module, crashing Vladimir Komarov into the ground.
These tragedies were a wake-up call and forced both space programs to be more diligent in testing and improving technology.
Meanwhile, the U.S. made lots of progress with Project Gemini, a series of 10 space missions that started to answer important questions about spacewalks, docking, gravity, and living in space.
Didn't all the astronauts get sick on one of those missions and just whine and complain the whole time?
Larry, imagine your nose full of snot and being in zero gravity. We're talking about snot mania here.
Gross. The Gemini project also gave the U.S. their claim to a true first in space. On Gemini 5, 2 astronauts spent 7 days in their capsule, breaking the endurance record and showing people could survive in space long enough to go to the moon and back.
Then, on Gemini 7, astronauts managed to rendezvous with another spacecraft. This was a really big deal since it was a crucial maneuver in order for the lunar trip.
The last big challenge was building a monster rocket, big enough for a moon mission. Von Braun had been working on the Saturn V for years. It had the power to launch Apollo and its 3 crafts, a command module, a service module, and a moon landing module.
The Soviets' mega rocket was called the N-1, a much more complicated design with 30 small rocket engines. This rocket actually beat ours to the moon in 1967 with 2 tortoises on board.
And since we know that this would have been impossible for the Soviets without chief designer Korolev, we can easily assume that the aliens felt bad for abducting him and decided to send their communist friends some helpful intel.
Well, Larry, it actually clearly wasn't that helpful, since they did include any plans for a lunar lander or how to rendezvous it back with their spacecraft after the moon landing. Meanwhile, the Americans were making great progress. Several successful crewed lunar missions set the stage for the main event in 1969.
When the Americans landed on the moon, we all know that was a setup and just as fake as your mustache.
How could you? I got this mustache from realmustaches.com. I grew it myself, and since I check my sources, I know that mine are legit and that my mustache is... Let's just not talk about my mustache.
Well, regardless if they faked the landing or not, the space race officially ended with the Apollo 11 mission when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon.
And so those famous words.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
After that, both sides stopped caring so much about the competition part.
Finally, we're moving from the great debate to diplomacy. It's called the period of détente. Both countries signed treaties acknowledging that technology capable of destroying the world is probably a bad idea. Duh.
And one of the biggest diplomatic moments happened in space. In 1975, the Americans and Soviets teamed up on the first international space mission when the Apollo spacecraft docked with the Soviet Soyuz capsule. The handshake between the 2 captains was a symbol showing they had made a truce to team up against the aliens.
Though handshakes symbolize the improvement in U.S. and USSR relations.
Finally, we could focus on the positives of the space race and the super cool tech that came after, like top secret flying cars. I mean GPS.
And solar cells, digital cameras, weather prediction, and modern communication technology.
It also changed the way people see the world, literally. In the photo taken from space in 1969 called Earthrise made us realize we are all from one common home. This helped push forward an environmental movement that led to the first Earth Day in 1970.
It all proves our argument that while the space race cost us crazy billions of dollars and lots of stress, it came with huge advancements in space exploration and that supercomputer phone in your pocket. So now it's time to sign off on today's episode of
Fact or Fiction?